In 1258, the city of Baghdad burned. The waters of the Tigris River ran red with the blood of thousands of victims. The Mongols, under the command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had just conquered the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. One of the most important cultural and intellectual centers in human history lay in ruins. Libraries that held centuries of knowledge were destroyed. The House of Wisdom, where scholars of all religions gathered to discuss philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy, was reduced to ashes. The last Abbasid Caliph was brutally executed, rolled in a carpet, and trampled by horses. The Mongols believed it was bad luck to spill royal blood directly on the ground. The Islamic world was in a state of utter shock. The city that had been the beating heart of civilization for over 500 years now lay in ruins. But this was not just another Mongol conquest. It was the continuation of a campaign of terror that had begun decades earlier on the steppes of Central Asia. The Mongols were not simply conquerors, they were a force of nature, a military machine so efficient and brutal that it seemed unstoppable. They had destroyed millennia-old empires, decimated entire populations, and created an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast to Eastern Europe. Cities that dared resist were utterly annihilated, their populations massacred to the last man, woman, and child as a warning to others. The very word Mongol had become synonymous with inevitable destruction. Now, after the fall of Baghdad, the Mongols turned their eyes westward. Syria lay in their path. Aleppo fell quickly, followed by Damascus. The ancient cities that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires now bowed before the horsemen of the steppes. Hulagu Khan sent ambassadors to Egypt with a clear and terrifying message. The letter stated that the Mamluk Sultan must submit immediately or face the same fate as all who had resisted. The message left no room for interpretation. It was either total submission or complete annihilation. Egypt, ruled by the Mamluks, was in an extremely delicate position. The Mamluks were a unique military class in history. The word Mamluk literally means slave. These were no ordinary slaves. They were elite warriors purchased at a young age, usually from regions such as the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the Black Sea steppes. They were taken to Egypt, converted to Islam, and subjected to rigorous military training that lasted years. They learned not only the arts of war, but also administration, politics, and religion. When they completed their training, they were freed and became members of an extremely loyal military elite. Although technically freed, they remained united by bonds stronger than any chain. They formed a military brotherhood that eventually seized power in Egypt. At that critical moment, their leader was Qutuz. He had recently assumed power under turbulent circumstances following the death of the previous sultan. Qutuz was himself a refugee. He had been captured as a child during the Mongol invasions of Central Asia and sold into slavery. Ironically, the man who would now face the Mongols had lost everything to them as a young man. His family had been killed, his homeland destroyed, and he had been dragged into a life of slavery. Through the Mamluk system, he transformed from a slave into one of the most formidable warriors of his generation. He was now the Sultan of Egypt. Few men in history understood the Mongol threat better than Qutuz. He had no illusions about what was to come. When the Mongol ambassadors arrived in Cairo with their demands for submission, the Mamluk court was divided. Many advisors argued that resistance would be suicidal. After all, what had happened to all the others who tried? The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most formidable powers in Central Asia, had been utterly destroyed. The Jin dynasty in China had fallen after decades of bloody resistance. The Principality of Kiev and other Russian lands had been devastated. Poland and Hungary had been invaded and were only spared total conquest because the Mongols returned to Asia after the death of the Great Khan. Empire after empire, army after army had been crushed under the hooves of Mongol horses. Why should Egypt be any different? But Qutuz made a decision that shocked many. He had the Mongol ambassadors executed. In medieval diplomacy, killing ambassadors was one of the greatest violations imaginable. It guaranteed all-out war with no possibility of negotiation or mercy. The Mongols were particularly sensitive to such offenses. When the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire executed Mongol merchants and ambassadors, Genghis Khan himself led a campaign of revenge. That campaign resulted in the complete destruction of that empire. Qutuz knew exactly what he was doing. He was burning all bridges. There would be no submission, no negotiation, no retreat. It would be victory or death. By executing the ambassadors, Qutuz was sending a message not only to the Mongols, but to his own people. They would fight come what may. But Qutuz was no fool. He knew that courage alone would not defeat the Mongols. The Mongols didn't win simply because they were ferocious. They were disciplined and tactically superior. To defeat them, the Mamluks would need strategy, intelligence, and precision. To understand their challenge, we must see what made the Mongol army so devastatingly effective. Their army was built around cavalry archers, a lethal combination few could counter. Every Mongol warrior was a highly trained rider and archer from childhood. By 15, a young Mongol was already a veteran in equestrian and archery skills. The Mongol composite bow was a masterpiece of engineering, made of wood, horn, and sinew, bonded in layers and left to cure for years. This bow could fire arrows over 200 meters with equal force. They could fire with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, turning in the saddle to fire backward, a technique known as Parthian shooting. Picture the scene. An enemy army advances, confident in its numbers. Suddenly, a cloud of horsemen appears, unleashing a storm of arrows before vanishing again. When the enemy pursues, the Mongols fire backward as they flee, inflicting even more casualties. This cycle of attack and retreat could continue for hours, bleeding the enemy until their formations collapsed in exhaustion. The Mongols had developed a communication system centuries ahead of its time. Using flags, drums, and special whistling arrows, commanders coordinated thousands of horsemen. Formations could split, reform, and flank with precision that left enemies baffled. European and Middle Eastern armies fought as disorganized masses seeking personal glory. The Mongols operated like a perfectly coordinated machine. Their military intelligence was equally impressive. They sent spies and reconnaissance long before their major campaigns. Mongol merchants mapped routes, strongholds, and enemy strength. By the time they attacked, they knew the land better than its defenders. They studied weaknesses, exploited divisions, and used psychological warfare. The Mongol reputation for brutality became a deliberate weapon. When cities heard how Baghdad had been destroyed, resistance evaporated. The Mongols also assimilated technology and knowledge from conquered enemies. In China, they captured engineers and learned siege warfare. Soon, a steppe people once avoiding walled cities were using catapults and explosives. Chinese, Persian, and Arab engineers were forced to serve in Mongol armies. Their knowledge made the Mongols even more dangerous. They had no pride to prevent them from adopting their enemies' best practices. If something worked, they incorporated it immediately. Furthermore, Mongol logistics were revolutionary. Each horseman traveled with several spare horses, allowing enormous distances without rest. While other armies marched 20 kilometers a day, the Mongols covered triple that. They lived on dairy, dried meat, and horse blood when necessary. This mobility let them appear where enemies least expected and vanish before reinforcements arrived. It was mobile warfare brought to perfection. The Mamluks looked north to Mongol-occupied Syria, knowing they faced not just an army, but a machine. However, the Mamluks had advantages others lacked. They were elite horsemen who trained constantly in mounted combat. They had decades of battle against the Crusaders in brutal desert wars. They were battle-tested and adaptable. Most importantly, they fought to defend their own land. For the Mongols, it was conquest. For the Mamluks, survival. Qutuz mobilized his army and summoned all available warriors. He released his rival Baibars, a brilliant commander exiled by intrigue. Qutuz placed unity above politics. Meanwhile, Hulagu Khan faced his own crisis, the death of his brother, the great Khan Möngke. He withdrew most of his forces, leaving only 20,000 under his general Kitbuka. Kitbuka was a veteran commander and a Nestorian Christian. His 20,000 horsemen were still formidable, though no longer overwhelming. Qutuz gathered 30,000 Mamluks and Bedouin auxiliaries, the odds finally even. Crossing the desert demanded perfect logistics and faith. He chose the valley of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, as the battlefield. The narrow terrain would neutralize Mongol mobility. Baibars led a smaller force forward to lure the Mongols inside. Kitbuka took the bait, confident in victory. As the Mongols pursued, Mamluk forces waited unseen among the hills. Then Qutuz gave the signal. Thousands of Mamluk horsemen erupted from hiding, surrounding the Mongols. For the first time in decades, a Mongol army was trapped. The clash was brutal and deafening. Qutuz removed his helmet and shouted, "Wa Islam!" His courage reignited the Mamluk lines. Hours of relentless combat turned the valley into a storm of steel. Finally, the Mongol formations broke. Kitbuka fought to the end and was killed in battle. The invincible had been defeated. News of Ain Jalut spread like wildfire through the Islamic world. The Mongol advance westward was permanently halted. Had the Mamluks lost, the Mongols might have destroyed Mecca and Medina. Instead, Ain Jalut marked the limits of Mongol expansion. Qutuz, the savior of Egypt, was assassinated soon after by Baibars. Baibars seized the throne and forged a powerful dynasty. For the Mongols, Ain Jalut was a humiliation that shattered their aura of invincibility. The victory saved Egypt and reshaped world history. It proved that knowledge, courage, and faith can overcome impossible odds. Even the greatest empires reach their limits. At Ain Jalut, the invincible Mongols met defeat, and the world was never the same again.